Hey all, so another Spotlight with context here. This is the Destroyer. I know I'm a bit behind on this, so thank you everyone for the patience and for checking in now. So just checking on base stats and attributes real quick. Solid prestige, pretty chunky health pool, and we can get right into the attributes. Survivability 3.5. This is kind of going to depend on how you're playing and who you're facing, right? The Destroyer doesn't have like the most robust universal defenses, but with several powerful immunities and with a pretty potent access to protection in buff heavy matchups, which are probably where you're going to be using them the most, this is going to matter. You know what? Them doesn't work for the Destroyer. I'm going with it. Gender doesn't even factor into this one. It's a husk. Anyway, moving on to damage. 4 is extremely fair. The Destroyer is not the fastest attacker out there. It does have to get to its special 3 to really close things out. But at the same time, when it does so, the fight's pretty much over. There's kind of some Mystic Titania vibes here, obviously without all of her same exact utilities. And so 4 definitely feels fair to me. Ease of use 3, getting to that 3 bars of power quickly and efficiently without getting hit in the face definitely takes a little bit of practice, and so I think this one is pretty fair. But once you get down that basic rhythm with a few variations, it's going to be what you do pretty much every time, and then you go special 3, special 2, and the fight's over. Utility 2, most of the utility here is coming in immunities or in some oblique buff control, but the Destroyer's buff control only touches indestructible and immortality, which is pretty much to just say, get out of my way, I'm trying to kill you. So I think a fairly low utility score is pretty accurate here. And then Defender Strength 4, the unstoppable while dashing forward is kind of annoying. The protection is kind of annoying. And if the Destroyer gets to the special 3 on the other side of the battlefield, it can also be game over. So definitely some real threats, but there are plenty of ways to counter the various pieces of this champion. So 4 feels about right. Moving on to strengths and weaknesses. Like we already talked about, protection. Against opponents with buffs, Destroyer gains protection, which just reduces all incoming damage. This is not an attack rating thing. This is not weakness. This is not critical rating or critical damage rating. This isn't resistance or armor. And so true damage doesn't cut through this. This is just I take less damage, for those of you who maybe are not super familiar with how protection works. Destroyer has incredibly potent power gain once it comes online, a full 4 bars of power, more than most other people, but in a very unique way with how concentrated it is. And then immunities, like we already talked about. The Destroyer has a lot of these, and we will get into those later. Weaknesses, non-damaging debuffs slow the Destroyer down. This is going to be something you want to be mindful of when facing and defending Destroyer, and also something you're going to want to avoid when using it on attack. Wither in particular, as well as Petrify, are a big problem for the Destroyer because they can turn around its really powerful power gain and make it so that you never get to that special 3. Big problem. And then if the opponent doesn't have buffs, then a lot of your sustainability just goes away completely because you are now a lot more vulnerable. And then grit is also a problem. The Destroyer is immune to slow, but relies on its unstoppable pretty frequently, and so a non-slow counter to unstoppable generally will slow it down. So, into the abilities. The Destroyer is a magical non-magnetic construct. It looks metal, but it's not. It's old and weird. Immune to slow, armor break, poison, and bleed. So immediately, that makes the Destroyer valuable on war offense, is how I particularly look at it, because that's a lot of immunities that instantly add value on hazard shift and on path 4, where that armor break comes up. This is a big deal. However, while the destroyer is not actually a robot, a bit closer to a golem, although obviously not quite the same, it does not benefit from salve or willpower. So, not a robot, but also not made of flesh. The destroyer is a killing machine with no emotions, so it is immune to infuriate and intimidate. All attacks that the destroyer lands destroy indestructible or immortality buffs on the opponent, replacing them with rubble buffs that last 15 seconds. So let's spend a second on this because this is new. This is not a nullify, right? Destroy is capitalized here, telling you that it's a gameplay mechanic, but it is a new one. It is not a nullify. It is not subject to nullify ability accuracy or immunity. It just removes the indestructibles and immortalities, and therefore does not trigger Mystic Dispersion right then, right? Because these buffs aren't expiring, they aren't being nullified, they are just being replaced. So no Mystic Dispersion when Indestructible and Immortality at first go away, but then they are replaced with rubble buffs that will expire, and then you get your Mystic Dispersion, right? I will also say going forward, I've seen some fear around this ability. It's like, oh, well, now they're making Cosmics immune to nullify, and so they're just going to start rolling out a bunch of Destroy to get around it. I'm not going to pretend that there is no element of that, right? Because clearly this is here to punish somebody like Hulkling, who reacts poorly to nullify but not to destroy. But I do just want to say that we as a game team are aware of the potential for power creep with this effect, and there is a reason that this only targets 2 buffs in particular. It's kind of for the same reason that Absorbing Man targets both of these buffs with his duration reduction, because these are ones that get in your way of just destroy. And so I would expect any use of the destroy mechanic in the future to be similarly limited, just to kind of manage some expectations there. When the opponent gains a buff while attacking the destroyer's block, destroy one of their newest buffs and replace it with a rubble buff. So this wording might be a little bit weird, but it's basically just trying to be accurate, right? It is possible, for various reasons, that maybe the exact buff gained right as hitting into block might not look like the one that gets destroyed, especially if there are multiple buffs being gained at once, but one of them will be for that hit into block. And so if it's only one buff, it should be that one, and then you have the same thing with the rubble buff and everything we talked about earlier. So this is mainly going to hit characters like Hulkling and Valkyrie, but there are some places to use this as an attacker as well. So moving on to magically enhanced armor, the destroyer goes passively unstoppable while dashing towards the opponent, and that unstoppable lasts half a second after the dash ends. So you can parry and then attack, but you have a very small window there while the destroyer is still unstoppable. If struck while dashing and unstoppable, then this effect goes on cooldown for 15 seconds, or until the opponent gains 3 buffs. That does include the dexterity buff, so if you're fighting the destroyer with somebody who gains buffs, this can end up being pretty quick, right? It can come right back, so be careful for that. While the opponent has an active buff, gain a protection passive, reducing damage taken by 5% for each buff, up to a max of 5 buffs. So this is what we talked about earlier. It's just scaling protection. It's normally 0. If the opponent has 1 buff, it's 5%. If the opponent has 5 buffs, it's 25%. Just scales in between there, right? No benefit past that 25% here. Moving on to destruction charges. You gain 2 destruction charges when immunity to armor break triggers, when the opponent gains a buff, or when they fail to gain a buff due to buff immunity. So dexing with somebody who is buff immune is still going to trigger these destruction charges, but somebody who just doesn't gain the buff, like Quicksilver or Silk, will dodge this, right? Now, gaining charges from buff immunity can only trigger once every 1.5 seconds, so there is a bit of a cooldown there to make sure that something like a multi-evade, like say for his special 2, doesn't just stack a bunch of destruction charges all right on top of each other. Gain 5 destruction charges when intercepting the opponent or when punishing a heavy or special attack, so that intercepting is going to be facilitated by your unstoppable. And in general, with the Destroyer, you are going to want to look for every opportunity to hit your opponent right as they are finishing a heavy or special. Lose 1 charge when inflicted with a non-damaging debuff other than stun, so you can't parry your way down on the Destroyer's destruction charges, but if you bring somebody like Titania, Quicksilver, Photon, etc., who places a ton of non-damaging debuffs, then you can get these charges back down, even if you are causing them to go up in other ways. Every 25 charges, the Destroyer gains a Fury passive for 20 seconds. You can stack up to 4 of these, and they are refreshed when the opponent is knocked down, including by a special 3. So you get these Furies going, you want to try and get them all online. So as you're playing the Destroyer and ramping it up, make sure you look for opportunities to land your heavy. Now, one thing I want to say is that this also can apply to punishing your opponent's heavy or special with your own heavy, because that counts as punishing a heavy or special, gaining you 5 charges, and also will trigger a knockdown, refreshing any Furies you have. So I personally find that to be one of the most helpful things to do with the Destroyer when possible. When you reach 100 charges, consume them and gain a power gain passive granting 4 bars of power over 10 seconds. So a full bar of power every 2.5 seconds. And while this power gain is active, the Destroyer cannot gain new charges. So the way you play the Destroyer is to gain charges as quickly as possible, knocking down the opponent periodically to hold on to your Furies. And then you trigger this power gain with 4 Furies, and that is going to let you use your dangerous special attacks to close out the fight. We'll get to those in a second. The special 1 is your ramping special, right? Each attack grants 10 destruction charges on a hit, block, or whiff. So the only way to avoid this is if the opponent dodges the attack with dexterity or a dexterity replacement. Now, this attack animation doesn't really let you do that to every single attack, so don't agonize too much over this. But if you're fighting Destroyer and you see 1 or 2 spots in that animation where you can consistently trigger a dex, it will help you slow things down a bit. As an attacker, it's not really going to matter. As a defender, it's 15 charges per hit, so that is your incentive to look for those windows. And then the final hit is passively unblockable and inflicts a non-stacking hinder debuff of 75% potency. So hinder is going to make any new buffs within that 20 seconds much weaker. This can be really nice because it can mean that your opponent can gain Furies, Precisions, whatever, dangerous buffs that aren't going to be nearly as powerful, but you still get protection and destruction charges from them. So it makes his ramp that much easier. You can kind of play with fire in that way. And if the opponent's against the wall, all hits are unblockable. The special 2 is your cash out, but you're not going to want to go straight for it. The first hit pauses degen effects for 10 seconds. The last 3 hits are passively unblockable, and the final hit deals a burst of damage that is 3 times as strong if the opponent is already suffering from a degen. And so for that, we move on to the special 3, which inflicts a degen passive for 15 seconds. It's a pretty potent degen, but really what you're trying to do here is activate the special 3 while the power gain is active, so that you can then loop back around to the special 2 quickly, fire that off, and get the triple burst damage on the last hit. If you line this up perfectly, it is very possible to potentially even get 2 special 2s off while the degen from the special 3 is up, and that kills most things. That overkills most things. Really, you don't have to worry about it. The first special 2 is pretty much always going to end a fight, but just calling out that it is technically possible. Now, also on the special 3, you get a 33% energized passive for 10 seconds,
which is pause during special attacks and basically just supplements the power gain or replaces it if you don't have it active, making it that much easier for you to get back up to just special 2, special 2, always special 2 is the focus after special 3. While this is active, you can't use your special 3, but also your specials 1 and 2 grant no power to the opponent. So nice trade-off there. And you go unblockable for 6 seconds. It's a buff, so it can be nullified or staggered, but oftentimes that won't matter that much. Now, Sig ability is just going to level you up overall. Your personal power gain pauses while at 3 bars of power, so you don't necessarily waste it. If you activate the power gain right below 3 bars and then can't throw it because you have to bait out a special, this gives you that much extra comfort with your rotation. And then while any power gain effect is active, your special 3 damage is increased by 50%. So just, again, enhancing the loop. The protection passive from magically enchanted armor is increased by a flat 5% per buff. Now you may remember the base potency is 5% per buff, so this just doubles it in strength. Side note, for any of you wondering why don't you just say it doubles in strength, it's because if you say things like potency is increased by 100%, which is the technically accurate way to say doubles in strength, then people would ask us why he doesn't have 100% protection. So we use the 5% flat here to just be very clear, even if a little bit pedantic. And then lastly, when struck, inflict an instant rupture, dealing 40% of the damage prevented by any personal protection as physical damage, because that is what an instant rupture is. And then this caps out at 1600 damage for this particular rank and rarity. This rupture also destroys any indestructible or immortality buffs on the opponent. So if you are trying to fight the destroyer with a buff-heavy champion, you are going to be taking damage back. Similarly, if you are using the destroyer and you get bopped, it might help you out, deal a little bit of damage to your opponent. In general, this is a very good reason to try and keep your buff count as low as possible when fighting it, or bring somebody immune to rupture, such as Spider-Punk or Scorpion. Now, moving on to synergies. For the Destroyer, Furies are 20% stronger when Odin or Loki is on the team. Odin gets a placebo buff during his special 2, which is of course going to allow you to deal extra burst damage on that special 2. It is a very nice synergy for him. And then Loki, when you steal buffs, any remaining buffs have a 50% chance to be nullified. For those unclear with how this works, Loki cannot actually copy all buffs. There is a defined list that works with the tech. I'm not going to go into that here. It's cursed. That's not a pun with Loki's special 3, but it's appropriate. Anyway, for all of the buffs that just do not work with his ability at all, we just leave them on the opponent, and what this does is give those a chance to also be nullified, making Loki's buff control that much better. With Maestro and Overseer, the Destroyer destroys one unstoppable or unblockable buff on the opponent for the first hit of each special attack, replacing them with Rebel. Obviously, this is going to be a little bit tricky to land if your opponent is actively unstoppable, but the Destroyer themselves goes unstoppable. The special 3 works for this. You can parry and then throw something if your opponent can be stunned. There are ways to use this, and then obviously it's great for controlling unblockable. This expands this expands the Destroyer's list of buffs that it can control to be exactly the same as Absorbing Man's for Unstoppable, Unblockable, Indestructible, and Immortality, and that is no accident. Those are kind of the 4 most annoying, most disruptive buffs. Maestro deals 25% extra damage in Cosmic Radiation, and the Overseer's personal taunt cooldown is cut in half, which is very powerful for letting him control the fight better, and for just generally having better uptime on the weakness component of that taunt. Moving on to Piloted, with Penny Parker and Howard the Duck, the Destroyer gains a significant chunk of energy resistance. Penny's power burn gets stronger, which is generally a good thing, but I do want to call out this can affect her rotation by meaning that you have to be a little bit further over a bar for your opponent when you throw the special one to get it to line things up perfectly. Just watch out for that. And then Howard the Duck gains a personal fury buff whenever the opponent purifies a stun debuff or is immune to it. For those who haven't played Howard, this is because Howard gains furies while the opponent is stunned. If you're having trouble applying the stun, you don't get the fury. So this just lets you ramp via the stun regardless. Really nice for just broadening out what Howard can safely do if you are already a fan of the Duck, as I am. And then lastly, with Morningstar, the Destroyer gains extra attack rating during Special 1, which just, helps you out while you're ramping. And Morningstar gets extra crit rating during the Special 1, which is huge for her if you haven't played her. Morningstar, as she ramps, deals a burst of damage on the Special 1, and it benefits from landing a critical hit. It is multiplied by her critical rating, right? And so the more crits you land during the Special 1, the more damage you do. Morningstar is generally famous for her Special 2 when it nullifies a bunch of buffs, but if you've played her a lot, you know that her primary damage output in most fights is actually the Special 1, and this synergy is incredible for that. So just touching on relics real quick, Ghost Rider, Juggernaut, whichever one you have a spare of will work great, right? Juggernaut is going to help out by augmenting being unstoppable, and Ghost Rider is going to help out by augmenting inflicting degen. Both of them are perfectly valid. Take your pick. And that is the Destroyer. I think it's a very strong addition to the contest. Obvious dual threat potential in Battlegrounds. Some value on defense in War. I think in War, their impact is definitely going to be felt more on the attacker side, where, as I said, the immunities are going to shine. Over a year ago now, when I designed Absorbing Man, one of my core goals there was to provide a key immunities champion to the Mystic class, because I felt that it was missing one. Absorbing Man did that job well, but there's still demand in that arena, and so the Destroyer is going to help out there as well. Just broaden things out, make assignments more flexible. You're going to want to have some around in the battle group. And I just generally think that they're fun to play, right? Like, it's not the fastest payout, but it is an incredibly fun one. Once you get good with it, it doesn't take that long to build up to the power game. Throw the Special 3, throw the Special 2, and it just deletes things. Very, very difficult to stop. Very cool champion. So hope you all enjoyed this. Again, apologies for taking this long. I promise to get next month's out more quickly. And until next time, thank you so much for watching, and take care.